The first thing I heard was the officer's voice cutting through the marble hallway like a knife. "Hey," I said, "wait outside, old man." Every conversation in the courthouse lobby stopped. Lawyers froze mid-sentence. Clerks looked up from their desks. A young mother waiting for a hearing instinctively pulled her son closer as the uniformed officer jabbed a finger toward the front doors. The elderly man he was yelling at couldn't have been more than 5'8", wearing a faded navy blazer, pressed khaki slacks, and polished brown loafers that had clearly seen decades of careful use. His silver hair was neatly combed, and a leather portfolio rested quietly in his hand. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the officer with calm grey eyes. "I have business inside," he said gently. "I don't care what business you've got," the officer snapped, taking another step forward. "Court employees only until security finishes the sweep. Read the sign, or do I need to read it for you?" A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Something about the old man's composure didn't match the way he was being treated. "I've entered through these doors every weekday for nearly 20 years, the gentleman replied, still perfectly calm. The officer laughed loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "Congratulations. Today you're waiting outside like everybody else." The old man nodded once. "If that's your final decision." "It sure is." Then the officer reached out and shoved the man's shoulder, not hard enough to knock him down, just enough to humiliate him. The leather portfolio slipped from the old man's hand, scattering neatly organized legal documents across the polished floor. My stomach tightened. I had been standing only 15 feet away, waiting for my own hearing, and every instinct told me I was watching a mistake unfold in real time. Several attorneys immediately bent down to gather the fallen papers. One of them suddenly stopped. His face lost every trace of color. He stared at the name printed across the first page. Then his eyes shot toward the elderly man. "Oh, my God." Another lawyer looked over his shoulder. Within seconds, both attorneys were standing perfectly still. One whispered something I couldn't quite hear. The other's eyes widened in disbelief. Before either of them could speak, the massive courtroom doors opened. A senior court administrator hurried into the lobby, looked directly at the elderly gentleman, and froze. Then, in front of everyone, including the officer who had just shoved him, she quietly said 5 words that turned the entire building silent. "Judge, everyone's waiting for you." The officer's confident expression disappeared instantly. His hand slowly fell away from his duty belt. And that was the exact moment I realized this wasn't going to end with an apology. It was about to become the biggest career-ending mistake that officer had ever made. Watching that officer go pale pulled me back to the beginning of how I ended up in that courthouse in the first place. My name is Thomas "Tom" Walker. I'm 68 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Lexington, Kentucky, and I live by a simple rule my father taught me. Respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost everything. Most people see an old man with gray hair and a slow, steady walk. They don't see the decades behind those wrinkles, the years spent raising 2 daughters with my late wife, Susan, grading papers until midnight, coaching debate after school, and trying to teach teenagers that character matters long after grades are forgotten. After Susan passed away 6 years earlier, the courthouse became an unexpected part of my life. I volunteered in community mediation programs, helping neighbors settle disputes before they became lawsuits. It wasn't glamorous work, but I believed communities stayed strong when people listened before they argued. That was also how I became acquainted with many people inside the county courthouse. I knew clerks by name. Bailiffs greeted me with a wave. Judges often stopped to ask about my grandsons. It wasn't because I held any special position. It was because I had spent years earning trust one conversation at a time. The hearing I was attending that morning had nothing to do with me personally. At least that's what I believed. A former student of mine, Emily Carter, now a young public defender, had invited me to observe a professionalism seminar being held after the morning docket. She said new officers and court personnel would be attending. "You always taught us that authority means responsibility," she'd told me over coffee the week before. "I'd love for you to meet some of the people starting their careers." I smiled and accepted without giving it much thought. That morning started like every other Tuesday. I left my small brick home just after 7, picked up coffee from the neighborhood cafe where the owner insisted on calling me professor, and drove downtown beneath clear blue Kentucky skies. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing hinted that before lunch, a single officer's temper would ignite an investigation reaching far beyond one embarrassing confrontation. As I parked near the courthouse, I noticed 3 unfamiliar police cruisers lined along the curb and several officers gathered outside the entrance. One of them was loudly complaining to another. "They say the new command staff wants us to treat everybody the same, no exceptions." His partner shrugged. "Just don't make the wrong person mad." The first officer laughed. "What are they going to do, fire me for doing my job?" I remember hearing those words as I walked past them. At the time, they sounded like ordinary workplace grumbling. Looking back, they were the first warning that someone inside that courthouse had forgotten the difference between enforcing rules and abusing authority. I reached the courthouse entrance just as the morning crowd began to swell. Lawyers in tailored suits balanced coffee cups and legal files. Jurors shuffled toward the security checkpoint with nervous expressions. Families whispered to one another, waiting for hearings that could change their lives forever. Normally, the atmosphere was orderly. That morning, it felt different. The officer standing at the metal detectors was the same one I'd overheard outside. His nameplate read, Officer Ryan Dalton. He looked to be in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with a crisp uniform and the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wasn't simply checking identification, he was barking orders. Laptop out. Move faster. Empty every pocket. When an elderly woman struggled to lift her walker onto the conveyor belt, Dalton sighed dramatically. "Come on, ma'am, you're holding up the entire line." A younger officer beside him quietly stepped in to help the woman. Dalton shot him an irritated look but said nothing. I continued toward the entrance, carrying only my leather portfolio. Before I reached the detector, Dalton held up a hand. "You." I stopped. "Yes, officer." "Step aside." I looked around, assuming he meant someone else. "Is there a problem?" "I'll decide if there's a problem." His voice was loud enough that several people turned to watch. I remained calm. "I don't mind waiting my turn." "I didn't say wait your turn," he replied sharply. "I said step aside." I quietly moved toward the wall. The younger officer leaned toward Dalton. "Sir, he's fine. He's not carrying—" "I didn't ask for your opinion." The younger officer fell silent. Dalton walked over until we were only a few feet apart. "Identification." I handed him my driver's license. He glanced at it for barely a second before tossing it back toward me. "You retired?" "Yes." "So you're not court staff?" "No." "Then you wait outside until I tell you otherwise." I blinked in surprise. "I'm attending a scheduled seminar after this morning's docket." "I don't care if you're attending a magic show." A few people chuckled nervously. Dalton seemed encouraged by the attention. "You old guys think because you've been around forever the rules don't apply." I met his eyes. "I've never believed that." "Good." He pointed toward the front doors. "So prove it." I took a slow breath. "I'm simply asking why I'm being singled out." "Because I said so." The words echoed through the lobby. One attorney quietly muttered, "This isn't going to end well." Dalton ignored him. Instead, he stepped closer until we were nearly shoulder to shoulder. "You've got 2 choices," he said. "Walk outside on your own, or I'll escort you." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ryan—" Dalton cut him off without looking away from me. "Stay out of this." For a moment, the lobby became eerily quiet. Every eye seemed fixed on us. I knew I could argue. I knew I could demand a supervisor. Instead, I simply asked one question. "Officer, are you absolutely certain this is how you want to handle this?" His smirk widened. "I've never been more certain of anything." Then he reached out, shoved me toward the doors, and my portfolio burst open across the polished marble floor. The courthouse fell silent, and in that silence, footsteps echoed from the hallway behind us. Someone important had just arrived. The echo of polished dress shoes against marble drew every eye in the lobby. A woman in a charcoal grey suit hurried toward us with the purposeful stride of someone used to solving problems before they became headlines. I recognized her immediately. "Judge Walker," she called. The moment she spoke my name, Officer Ryan Dalton's smirk faded. She stopped beside me instead of the officer, kneeling to gather the papers that had spilled from my portfolio. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" "I'll be fine, Rebecca," I replied, helping her collect the remaining documents. Dalton looked from her to me, clearly confused. "Your Honor?" Rebecca Mills, the court's chief administrator, stood and faced him. "This is Judge Thomas Walker, Senior Administrative Judge for the 6th Judicial Circuit." Dalton frowned. He wasn't wearing a robe. Several attorneys exchanged looks of disbelief. Rebecca stared at him for a long second before answering. "Judges don't wear robes into the parking lot, officer." A nervous laugh escaped someone near the security checkpoint, but it died almost immediately. The younger officer beside Dalton looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Dalton cleared his throat. "Nobody told me." Rebecca's expression hardened. The judge introduced himself politely. "You demanded he leave." "I was following security procedures." "Were your procedures to shove a sitting judge in front of 50 witnesses?" Dalton opened his mouth, then closed it again. I picked up the last folder and tucked it into my portfolio. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "I'd like everyone to take a breath." She nodded, though I could see she was furious. The lobby began moving again, but conversations were now reduced to whispers. Every attorney who passed glanced at Dalton. Every deputy avoided eye contact with him. I could have demanded his suspension on the spot. Instead, I simply asked Rebecca to continue with the morning schedule. She looked surprised. "You're not filing an immediate complaint?" "I haven't decided." Dalton visibly relaxed, assuming the worst had passed. He was wrong, because my concern had shifted. This wasn't about one rude officer anymore. It was about how an officer felt comfortable treating any citizen that way when he believed no one important was watching. If he'd done it to me, how many others had experienced the same thing? After the morning docket concluded, I quietly requested access to routine administrative records, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted answers. Rebecca met me in my chambers with a stack of files. "Tom," she said, closing the door behind her, "if you're looking for complaints involving Dalton, there are more than you'd expect." She laid several folders across my desk. Citizen complaints, internal memos, informal coaching notes. None of them had led to formal discipline. One report caught my attention. An elderly veteran claimed Dalton had publicly humiliated him at the same security checkpoint just 3 months earlier. The complaint had been marked "Resolved, no further action." I frowned. "Who signed this off?" Rebecca slid one final document toward me. When I saw the signature authorizing the dismissal, my pulse slowed. It wasn't Dalton's supervisor. It was someone much higher in the courthouse hierarchy, someone I had trusted for years. And suddenly I realized this investigation wasn't just about one officer. It might expose a culture of protection that reached far beyond the courthouse entrance. I stared at the signature for several seconds. There was no mistake. It belonged to Harold Benson, the court security director. Harold and I had worked in the same courthouse for nearly 12 years. We weren't close friends, but we had always maintained a professional relationship. He'd often spoken about accountability, respect, and public confidence in the justice system. Yet there, in black ink, was his approval dismissing a complaint from an 82-year-old military veteran who claimed he'd been mocked and shoved by Officer Ryan Dalton. I looked up at Rebecca. "How many complaints has Benson reviewed?" She opened another folder. "Officially, 23 involving Dalton over the last 4 years. And how many resulted in discipline?" Rebecca hesitated. "None." The room fell silent. None, not a written reprimand, not a suspension, not even mandatory retraining. I leaned back in my chair trying to make sense of it. "Was there ever body camera footage?" Rebecca nodded. "That's the strange part. Several reports mentioned body camera recordings, but when Internal Affairs requested them, they were listed as unavailable due to storage errors." "Storage errors," I repeated, over and over again. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. I immediately requested an independent audit of the Security Division's records. Because of my administrative authority, the request couldn't simply be ignored. Within 48 hours, a team from the county's Office of Professional Standards began reviewing archived server logs instead of relying on the files maintained by courthouse security. The results were staggering. The body camera videos hadn't been lost. They had been manually flagged to prevent automatic retention. Someone with administrative access had repeatedly altered the retention settings after complaints were filed, ensuring the footage would be deleted before investigators could review it. That required authorization, and only a handful of people possessed that level of access. Harold Benson was one of them. When investigators confronted him, he insisted it was an innocent clerical mistake. Unfortunately for him, digital records don't have emotions, they have timestamps. Every deletion occurred within hours of a citizen complaint naming Officer Dalton. The evidence was impossible to explain away. News of the audit spread through the courthouse faster than I expected. Some employees quietly thanked me. Others suddenly stopped speaking when I entered a room. Then the pressure started. An anonymous envelope appeared under my office door. Inside was a single photograph of my house. No note, no signature, just the picture. The following evening, I noticed an unfamiliar SUV parked across the street from my home for nearly an hour before driving away without its headlights on. Rebecca urged me to request police protection. I refused. "I'm not going to let intimidation influence this investigation," I told her. She sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." 3 days later, the Judicial Conduct Committee scheduled an emergency public hearing. Officer Dalton, Harold Benson, multiple witnesses, digital forensic experts, every piece of evidence would be presented under oath. For the first time since this began, I wasn't wondering whether the truth would come out. I was wondering how many careers would end when it did. The courtroom was filled long before the hearing officially began. Every seat in the gallery was occupied. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder with local attorneys, retired judges, law students, and courthouse employees. The quiet murmur that usually filled a courtroom before proceedings was replaced by an uneasy silence. Everyone knew this hearing was bigger than one officer. It was about whether the courthouse had protected misconduct for years. I entered through the side door, not as the presiding judge, but as the complainant and primary witness. To avoid any conflict of interest, the case was assigned to Judge Eleanor Whitmore, a respected jurist known throughout Kentucky for her uncompromising integrity. She looked across the packed courtroom. "This hearing concerns allegations of misconduct, abuse of authority, destruction of public records, and obstruction of internal investigations. Counsel, you may proceed." The county special prosecutor stood first. "Your Honor, today's evidence will show that Officer Ryan Dalton repeatedly abused members of the public, while Court Security Director Harold Benson knowingly concealed that misconduct." Dalton sat rigidly beside his attorney. Benson avoided looking at anyone. The first witness was the younger officer who had been working security that morning. He adjusted the microphone nervously. "Were you present during the incident involving Judge Walker?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes." "Describe what you observed." He swallowed. "Judge Walker was polite the entire time. He never argued. Officer Dalton ordered him outside, insulted him, and then pushed him. There was no security threat." Dalton's attorney immediately stood. "Objection, characterization." "Sustained," Judge Whitmore replied. "Witness, state only what you personally observed." "Yes, Your Honor." The young officer nodded. "I personally saw Officer Dalton place both hands on Judge Walker and forcefully push him." The courtroom remained silent. Next came 3 attorneys who had witnessed the confrontation. Their testimony matched almost word for word. Then Rebecca Mills took the stand. She explained the history of citizen complaints and described how she had uncovered repeated dismissals without meaningful review. Finally, the county's digital forensic examiner approached the witness box carrying a thick binder. He connected his laptop to the courtroom display. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "computer systems leave fingerprints." The first screen showed the official complaint timeline, the second displayed server access logs, the third overlaid both records. Colored lines connected complaint dates with manual changes to body camera retention settings. Every alteration occurred within hours of a complaint against Dalton. Every authorization traced back to Harold Benson's administrator credentials. Benson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His attorney whispered frantically into his ear. The prosecutor walked toward the screen. "Mr. Benson claimed these deletions were accidental." The forensic examiner nodded. "That statement is inconsistent with the evidence. Can you explain why?" "Because these changes required 6 separate administrative actions. They cannot occur by accident." A ripple swept through the gallery. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. So you're telling this court that someone intentionally prevented these recordings from being preserved? Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor paused before asking one final question. Based on your examination, is there any evidence these records were altered by Officer Dalton? The examiner looked directly toward the defense table. No. The courtroom became perfectly still. Every eye turned toward Harold Benson. For the first time that day, Dalton looked less angry than terrified, because the man who had protected him for years had just become the prosecution's biggest piece of evidence. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses and looked slowly from Benson to Dalton. Then she spoke the words everyone had been waiting to hear. The court will recess for 30 minutes before I deliver my findings. The fate of both men now rested on what she would say when she returned. 30 minutes felt longer than the entire hearing. No one left the courtroom. Reporters quietly reviewed their notes. Attorneys whispered in small groups, carefully avoiding the defense table. Officer Ryan Dalton sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if the answers might somehow be hidden in the polished wood beneath his boots. Harold Benson looked even worse. For the first time since I'd known him, the confidence that had defined his career was completely gone. When the courtroom deputy announced, "All rise," every conversation ended instantly. Judge Eleanor Whitmore returned to the bench with a thick folder in her hands. After everyone was seated, she looked directly at the two men before speaking. This court has carefully reviewed the testimony, documentary evidence, digital forensic analysis, and applicable policies governing courthouse security. The silence was absolute. She continued, "The evidence establishes that Officer Ryan Dalton engaged in conduct unbecoming of a law enforcement officer by abusing his authority, treating members of the public with unnecessary hostility, and using physical force where none was justified." Dalton closed his eyes. Judge Whitmore didn't pause. The evidence further establishes that Court Security Director Harold Benson knowingly failed to investigate repeated complaints and intentionally authorized actions that resulted in the destruction of public records relevant to official investigations. A reporter beside me immediately began typing at incredible speed. Judge Whitmore signed the order in front of her. Effective immediately, Officer Ryan Dalton is terminated from courthouse security. His law enforcement certification shall be referred to the State Standards Board for revocation proceedings. Dalton's shoulders slumped. He didn't argue. He didn't even look up. Benson is hereby removed from his position, pending criminal prosecution for obstruction of justice, destruction of public records, and official misconduct. A quiet gasp swept through the gallery. The bailiff stepped forward. For the first time in his career, Harold Benson wasn't giving orders. He was being escorted from the courtroom. As they passed my table, he stopped. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I met his eyes. "I wish you'd been sorry before all those complaints were ignored." He lowered his head and continued toward the exit. The courtroom remained silent until Judge Whitmore addressed everyone once more. "Justice depends on public trust. The badge and the bench exist to serve the people, not to intimidate them. When that trust is abused, accountability is not optional." Those words hung in the room long after she left the bench. In the weeks that followed, the county ordered a complete review of courthouse security practices. Every unresolved citizen complaint from the previous 5 years was reopened. New policies required independent oversight whenever allegations involved court security personnel, and body camera retention procedures were placed under outside management. Several former complainants, including the elderly veteran whose case had first caught my attention, received formal apologies from the county. As for me, I returned to my chambers with mixed emotions. I hadn't wanted careers destroyed. I had wanted a justice system worthy of the people it served. Sometimes holding the system accountable is the only way to protect it. A year has passed since that morning in the courthouse lobby, but I still think about it every time I walk through those front doors. Not because I remember being shoved, because I remember how easily it could have happened to someone with no voice, no witnesses, and no one willing to ask difficult questions. The courthouse feels different now. Security officers greet visitors with professionalism instead of impatience. New training emphasizes respect just as much as procedure, and every complaint is reviewed independently. Those changes didn't erase the past, but they helped ensure the same mistakes aren't repeated. People sometimes ask whether I regret filing the complaint. My answer is always the same. No one is above accountability, not a judge, not a police officer, not an administrator, and certainly not someone wearing a badge who mistakes authority for power. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: respect is earned through character, and true authority is measured by how you treat the people who cannot do anything for you. Thank you for spending your time with me and following this journey from beginning to end. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority or seen someone stand up for what's right when it mattered most? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping story of justice, courage, and accountability. Until next time, remember, the strongest people don't demand respect, they inspire it. End.